So what actually even is knitting anyway? First, let's imagine a simple line, and then let's draw some loops in it. And then let's say that that line is actually a little bit longer, and we can stretch it out and put the longer tail of that line behind those loops. And then through those loops, let's pull a new set of loops. Then let's repeat that pattern over and over, building up a new row of loops each time. Now let's replace our line with actual yarn and pull everything tight, and you now have a swatch of knitted fabric. Now normally the yarn at the top of your work would be connected to a whole ball of yarn, and a knitting needle would be holding up the row of loops to keep them from coming undone. And then a second knitting needle is used to help pull more loops and help build up that fabric. Each one of these little V's is called a stitch. This particular stitch is called the stockinette stitch. It's one of the most common types of knitting you'll come across, and it's kind of the first thing people think of when they think about knitting, is those classic V shapes. If you look close enough at your t-shirt or pants or anything you've got around the house, then you're most likely going to see some form of the stockinette stitch pattern. Now, if you're just starting to learn how to knit, your knitting is most likely not going to look like this stockinette pattern. It's probably going to look more like this, which is fine. This is called the garter stitch. It's nice and thick, and it looks the same on both sides. And the reason that this garter stitch gets created is where knitting gets a little bit more complicated. So when you're knitting, you're essentially just going back and forth down your rows of stitches and then back, and you're building up that pattern over and over again. The problem is we are only human and we only have our hands and needles to work with. So when you get to the end of a row, there's no easy way that we can knit backwards to the start of the row. So what we have to do is we have to turn our work around and work from the back side. Knitting the back side lets us go back down that row and add another row of stitches. But because this is the back side, your hands have to use a slightly different motion in order to keep building up that stockinette stitch pattern of V's. So when you're first learning how to knit, it's most likely you're just going to learn that one first method of knitting. And you can't rely on that same method when you're knitting the back side. So this means that there's actually two main motions that you'll want to learn with knitting. The first is knitting, which is the motion you use when you're facing the front of the work and creating those V's. And the second is purling, which is when you're facing the back side of the work and you're facing that almost bumpy, some might say purly texture, even though purls in knitting is spelled P-U-R-L and not P-E-A-R-L, but whatever. And now it's important to note that knitting is just arts and crafts. It's nothing else. And even though you can definitely fall down the rabbit hole of technicality and terminology, at the end of the day, you're just taking a piece of string and turning it into a hat or a scarf or a sweater. And right this second, somewhere in the world, there's probably a machine that's churning out 100 hats and scarves and sweaters every minute. So don't worry, or maybe worry a little bit, but not about knitting. So back to the project at hand, we have a front side and a back side. The front is knitted and the back is purled. If your knitting project is flat, like a scarf, then you're probably going to be knitting that on 2 needles and turning it around and purling the back side. If you're knitting something in the round, so you're creating a project that is round, like a hat or a sock or another sock, then you'll be knitting on circular knitting needles or double pointed needles to create a round shape. And you'll actually never be turning your work around. You'll just be turning it and knitting the front the whole time and not worrying about the back side. Once you've learned this whole knitting and purling front side and back side, that's when a whole world of patterns is gonna open up to you. So what happens if you knit on the purl side instead of purl? Or what happens if you alternate knitting and purling every other stitch for the entire project? These are the types of questions that create really interesting textures in your work and make knitting a really fun hobby. So I think I've answered the question about what is knitting. There's still, you can still talk about like yarn weight and gauges, cable knitting, needle size, different cast-on methods, which I don't really even know anything about, synthetic versus wool, sheep, the reverse stockinette stitch, I-cord, felting, speed knitting, continental knitting, the Norwegian pearl, alpaca, t-shirt yarn, amigurumi, yarn bombing, circular knitting needles versus double-pointed needles, arm knitting, finger knitting. If you enjoyed this video, then you will also enjoy my novel, The Disassembly of Dorian Durand, which I will warn you has absolutely nothing to do with knitting, but it is similar to this video in the sense that it is something that I created and you might enjoy. Links for more info and how to buy are down below in the description, and otherwise I'll see you next time.